No matter how much the leader wants to inspire or motivate the faculty, he or she has little control over their inner drives. What the leader can do is create the conditions that would facilitate their motivation. The way that they facilitate the motivation is through their efforts to form a conducive culture within the school. During this module, we are going to look at the formation of an effective culture and climate. This is one of the topics that I believe is crucial to the success of the leader, and one of the reasons that I wanted to spend time examining it. First, we must realize that even though for the average person these terms are used interchangeably, but to do so causes one to fail to see the dynamic interplay between them. In this module, we're going to look at culture and climate from different perspectives to see the evidence of that interplay. Before we get too deep in the weeds, let's take a moment and clarify the terms that we're using here. First, let's define culture. It is a system of shared values and beliefs that interact with the people within the organization and within the control mechanisms and structures to produce behavioral norms. There are three key ideas that must be further defined in order for this definition to be useful. First, when I use the word belief, I'm referring to those ideas that are considered to be true by everyone in the organization. Now, the truth for your organization can be different from mine. This is not to say that there is no universal truth, but I'm making the distinction between each organization having a set of truths that they support and by which they live. These truths can be consistent with the universal truth, or they can be inconsistent with universal truth. The inconsistency does not change the veracity of the belief for those within the organization. Where the inconsistency becomes problematic is when the organizational environment intersects the external environment and the truths, the universal and the organizational, clash. At that point, it may become necessary to reevaluate the organizational belief. By way of example, the Catholic Church taught for centuries that the sun revolved around the earth. Earth, in other words, was the center of the solar system. This belief was consistent with the world view at that time. Then Nicholas Copernicus and Galileo suggested that this belief was wrong, that actually the earth revolved around the sun. Research was conducted and eventually demonstrated that the church's belief, or the church's teaching, was wrong, and it had to finally change its belief and alter its teaching to conform to the universal truth that we live in a heliocentric solar system. This is how truth does change when confronted with evidence. Truth must eventually conform to reality, or the belief is of no importance to the organization. It does nothing. The second key idea is values. This word describes what is important to the organization. These ideas define an organization, and they are what makes it different from other organizations. Values change a little more easily than do organizations' beliefs. Also, values do not have to conform to the environment surrounding the organization. That inconsistency is tolerated because it is those values that make the organization unique and what it is. For example, Walmart's values may be different than Target's values, and that's okay. They can have different sets of values because they serve different customers, even though they may serve them within the same environment of the community. They're reaching out to them with a different set of values, and people shop at Walmart for one reason and shop at Target for another. So an organization may set for itself a level of excellence that is much higher than similar organizations. Even though the other organizations do not follow suit, that doesn't diminish what the organization considers to be important. In many cases, it is a point of pride for the organization to indicate how they are different from their competition because they have higher standards or better quality products. You are all too young to remember the Paul Masson wine commercials in the early 70s. But the commercial started out with the actor Orson Welles speaking about the finer things in life and what it took to create them and how long it took to create them. Then he changes the topic a bit about making wine and how it's important to be patient with the process. If you rush the process, you get lousy wine. That's really the heart of the commercial. Then it comes to the tagline, the phrase that we want you to remember. At Paul Masson, we will sell no wine before it's time. They did an excellent job with the commercial because 40 plus years I still remember that commercial. And really the point of the commercial is to say we're not about making money. It's not about making a lot of bad wine and selling it and getting it on the market. But at Paul Masson, the whole point was we want to make quality wine. That was one of their values. And it separated it from Ernest and Giulio Gallo and a host of other wines. You see, values don't have to conform to reality as beliefs do. This conflict with reality is acceptable and is often touted as a badge of honor, hence the Paul Masson commercial. The last idea that needs some clarification is the behavioral norms. The norms of an organization answer the question of how we do things around here. They are an outgrowth of the organization's beliefs and values. When we say that each organization is different, we're usually referring to the norms. These are the more observable features of the organization. For example, here at Troy, we have the Trojan Way, which specifies how we will behave while at Troy. When new employees are brought on, they are taught the culture of the organization. Some features of it are observed while others are taught. In addition to beliefs, values, and norms, we cannot overlook the fact that there are other items that make up the culture of an organization. The history, rituals, traditions, relics, and stories also shape the culture. These may be the more tangible or observable facets of the culture. Every organization has a past, a history to which they are constantly adding. Sometimes this is referred to as institutional memory or knowledge. This history can be written down, but it also lives in the people that experienced it. Organizations also have rituals and traditions that are important to them and define what it means to be a member of that particular culture. These are the things that are done on a regular basis that are meaningful and solidify membership in that culture, so that when certain milestones are achieved, these milestones are commemorated with a ceremony or celebration that separates them from the day-to-day life of the organization. Next comes the relics that are important pieces of the history of the organization. They become the touchstones that connect the current members of the organization with those that have gone on before. These relics are displayed prominently in the facility. Some examples might be trophies that are displayed in a special case where people can see them as they enter the building or exit the building. They may be products produced by the organization, and there's a whole history of the organization in the products that they've produced and how the labeling has changed over the years. Just go to the Coca-Cola Museum in Atlanta and you can see their relics of their past all throughout the many years of this company. These are the important bits of the past that document the past and make it real to those living in the present. The last item is the stories that we tell the new generation of people. It usually starts out with, do you remember when John Brown did so-and-so at the company picnic? These stories are not the formal history of the organization, but the informal history of life within the organization. They are the emotional connections to the organization. Oftentimes, it is these stories that become more important than the formal history of the organization. They are more about the people than the events of the organization. These stories become epic and even grow in intensity as different people tell the story. They grow to the point that they even take on a life of their own. Yes, they're instructive, and that's why we are telling them and retelling them. Even though the new employee did not experience the event, they can share in the lesson or the moral of the story. I remember one such story at Troy. Dr. Hawkins told it on himself, but it so happens that one day he was driving down University Boulevard, and he noticed a male student wearing his pants too low for the chancellor's taste, so he stopped his car and rolled down the window. Dr. Hawkins called the student over to his car and told him to get in. The student, recognizing who it was speaking to him, dutifully obeyed. As they drove down the street, Dr. Hawkins explained to the student how important his image was and that of the university, and that he was a representative of this university. He also went on to tell the student that you only get one chance to make a first impression, and so on and so on. You can imagine the sermon that student heard. At the end, Dr. Hawkins asked the student, "Well, do you have anything to say for yourself?" The student meekly replied, "Can I get out now? My class is back that way about a mile." Dr. Hawkins told that story years ago at a faculty convocation, and I still smile at the mental image that it created. I remembered the lesson that we need to make sure our students are appropriately dressed for class. Well, online instruction kind of makes that point moot, but we all get the message. If the chancellor was going to hold the standard high, we needed to do so as well. And that's what stories contribute to the culture of the organization. Together, history, rituals, traditions, relics, stories, beliefs, values, and norms shape the climate within the organization. Now, the climate is the environment or atmosphere of the organization. The climate is the perceptions of the individuals within the organization on any given day. Now you notice I'm separating it from culture, because it's very different. Culture is a part of the climate, not climate being part of the culture. I want to make that distinction perfectly clear. Now, while the culture of an organization takes time to develop and change, the climate forms very quickly, and it changes just as quickly. It is either positive or negative. Put another way, functional or dysfunctional. Culture, on the other hand, is what it is, neither positive nor negative, because climate is nothing more than the perceptions of the people within the organization or those who come in contact with it. The climate is catchy from the point of view that it's like a cold. You hang around with somebody who's got a cold, and it's not long before you have it. And it goes on from person to person. Visitors pick up on the climate by their interaction with the members of the organization. They say things like, "It was very warm and inviting to be there," or "it was the opposite." Even people within the organization pick up on the climate from one another. So when you hear complaints by employees about whatever it is, they are usually referring to the climate of the organization, not necessarily the culture. Where culture is taught, I want to make that distinction clear here, we teach people the culture. We present it to them and allow them to learn what the culture is. The climate is caught. That's shared from employee to employee. And that's why it's so important to maintain a functional climate, because it can have deleterious impacts on organizational performance. A central aspect of organizational culture is framed by norms and assumptions. As previously stated, the norms answer the question of how we live life here. Put another way, norms are the rules that guide us into acceptable behavior. Norms are specific to each organization. Just as every household has specific rules that govern behavior, so do organizations. The very task for the new employee is to learn the rules of the organization. Now, if they're assigned a mentor, this learning process is made easier. Without that kind of support, it can become very difficult to figure out what is okay and what is not. Now, usually the new employee observes the behavior of others and follows their example. Generally, adults know what's acceptable and what's not acceptable within the workplace. Assumptions are different from norms in that they are the beliefs about what is true and therefore what should be done. Now, they're the foundation to which the norms of the organization are anchored. These assumptions explain why such and such behavior is acceptable and why other behaviors are not acceptable. So when an employee asks, "Well, why do we do this and not that?" it's because of the assumptions that we hold to be true. Unfortunately, in many organizations, people don't know why it is that they don't do a certain thing. It's because, well, we've always done it this way. The 7 last words of any organization. Norms and assumptions are usually unwritten, but as far as the the norms are concerned, they're shared widely and ascribed to all. They're constantly reinforced. The assumptions, on the other hand, are more elusive. People understand the norms, but often do not understand the root of the rule, the assumption. And that creates a situation, because we ask, who creates the assumptions? Who sits at that table where they are composed? Are they handed down from on high or written by the finger of God? Critical theorists would argue that to leave one group unrepresented where these assumptions are made diminishes the assumption's validity. Therefore, we must bring these assumptions to light and have a conversation about them. Are they still relevant? Are they still an accurate depiction of reality? Think back to a geocentric or a heliocentric solar system. Take, for example, the popular assumption that guides all schools: no child will be left behind. Is that an accurate picture of public education today? Probably so. We work very hard to make certain that all students have an opportunity to learn and achieve. What is a norm that is anchored to that foundation? It would most likely be response to intervention. Multiple levels of intervention, in other words. This program has been adopted and must be implemented in all classrooms so that we can demonstrate that we have done everything that we can to leave no child left behind. Think about your school. I'd bet you'd know the norms right off, but coming up with the assumptions that serve as the basis of those norms might be a bit more difficult. Edgar Schein identified three components of culture that have their roots in the norms and assumptions of the organization. The first attribute are the solution or the answers to the problems encountered by the organization. As the organization faces these problems, they apply the solutions that have worked in the past. As these solutions continue to solve problems, that they are continually used. They are used so much that as new employees are brought on, they are told that this is how we handle this particular situation. There is no thinking about trying a new way because the old way still works. It might even seem trite to say it, but the 7 most important words of any organization are, we've always done it this way. More than just a utilitarian or pragmatic approach to solving problems, these solutions become the official way, the correct way to think, perceive, and feel about these problems. We might call it the party line. And I'm not referring to the old telephone line, but the political party dogma or the official list of beliefs. Now, once the solution has been tried and proven to be useful to recurring problems, it becomes solidified into the belief system of that organization. These solutions become part of an environmental reality of that organization. They become the beliefs that the organization and about how the world operates and the organization's place within this world. Over time, the beliefs are taken for granted. No one considers whether or not they are valid or still applicable to current situations. They are just instinctively applied. At this point, these beliefs are the only acceptable way to deal with situations, and they are taught to all new employees of the organization. This is the place where leaders need to pause and reflect on what's being done to determine if it's still valid. Problems change over time, and we might be implementing solutions that work but do not solve the current problems. In other words, we're applying a solution to a problem that no longer exists. It is a matter of solving problems that, as I've just said, no longer exist. That is the point where you must come up with new solutions and communicate to everyone the new way of doing things. This is what causes conflict within an organization, because you are asking people to do their job in a new way. And they will tell you that they have always done it in a certain way. That was the way that they were trained 25 years ago by the person who was trained by someone 25 years before that. Change is difficult, and it's especially hard when you're dealing with the elements of organizational culture. Now, this diagram shows you how cultures form. Norms and assumptions become the culture, along with the history, traditions, rituals, stories, symbols, and relics. The authors indicate that if we're to change an organization to make it more effective, we must change the culture. To do that, we must alter the course of the organization's history. Now, the first time that you read this sentence in the textbook, you might have had the same thought that I did. You cannot change the past. It is what it is. It makes far more sense to me to change the future course of the organization rather than trying to change a past course. What the authors are trying to convey is that to change an organization, you must make a course or directional change. This involves a recognition that the old course was not leading you to the place where it needed to go. In other words, a course correction was necessary. I also question whether or not change can be achieved simply by changing the culture. Since it takes years to develop, it will most likely take years to change. It might make more sense to just replace the culture with new norms and assumptions. Remember that the heart of the culture is the rules by which we live and the beliefs on which those rules are founded. Now, those are very difficult to change because they are the identity of the organization. They are what make it unique because they are taken for granted as the only way to behave, think, or whatever. They are hard to identify. We will talk more about organizational change next week in Module 7, so I won't go very deep here. But a question comes to mind that was mentioned in passing. Is it really possible to change the culture, or is it replacing one culture with a new one? I don't know if my answer is the answer or just what I'm thinking right now, but at this point, I don't think it's possible to change the culture by adjusting the norms and assumptions. I am more convinced that one needs to replace the norms and assumptions. What we're dealing with is organizational reality. When we are considering the assumptions of the organization, especially, remember that I use the word solution to organizational problems as the definition of norms. It would be very hard to convince someone that these solutions are no longer valid when they have worked for so long. What we must do is give them new solutions to new problems, which then requires new beliefs to support those new norms. In this way, you replace parts of the culture until the entire culture is changed. So why don't you change cultures more often? First, I think it's just a very difficult task. Second, and probably more importantly, is that leaders confuse the climate with the culture. So they address structural issues, environmental issues, power relationships, tangible elements of the culture, but they do not deal with the substantive elements of that culture, the history, traditions, rituals, and stories. In other words, we deal with the superficial elements of the climate. Our hope is that this will impact the culture, but it will not, because climate is a daily perception of the environment, the people, the organization, workload, facilities, and the assumptions and beliefs which comprise the culture. Making changes in the climate will certainly have an effect on the day-to-day operation, but will not have a more permanent impact on life within the organization. I cannot accept that culture is something that just develops independently of our actions. I do not see it as a random manifestation of the interactions of the people within the organization. Culture is purposefully created. It can be thought of as a filter or a series of lenses that help the people make sense of the world around them. The culture of my organization is going to be similar in some ways and different in some ways to your organization. The environment of this world is filled with thousands of cultures interacting with the larger environment and being impacted by it. Also, they are interacting with other cultures. To illustrate how the climate is separate from the culture, I've put it within the culture, but it is a perception of the culture, but in addition, it is a perception of the organization itself. If culture is purposefully created, as I think it is, then the stories we tell about the events and situations we experience in the organization are remembered for a reason. The relics that we honor and the rituals we observe are all kept with a reason in mind. We didn't just decide to keep that trophy. We purposefully kept it and put it in a place of honor. And we know that we're creating the culture. Even though maybe we don't admit it to ourselves, we know that our actions are becoming the culture of that organization. And each one of us gives our part to develop that culture as we work there. And then when we retire, we move on, and other people come and add to the culture. So the culture changes somewhat just because new people are experiencing it and adding to it, but also the climate changes in that very same way as new people come and people leave. But for those that the culture develops on its own, independent of the people in the organization, believe that the history, traditions, relics, and stories did not start out as a part of the culture, but because the humans told them and retold them, they rose in stature to the level of importance, and they were deemed worthy of passing on from generation to generation. So a particular relic was not valuable in its own right, but became important as a link to tangible evidence to some past important moment within the organization's history. What does culture do for us? Simply, culture tells us who we are and why we are different from others, what is important to us, and also how we live life here. So how does understanding culture help the leader? Before you make changes to an organization, you need to understand the organization that created the culture. We know that organizational culture is made up of many subcultures, and there are lots of moving parts. One change can impact lots of other parts that creates a chain reaction and results in unintended consequences. Therefore, it's wise to take our time in making changes until you understand what the culture is and see the relationship to each moving part. I'm not suggesting that you don't make any changes, because it would be argued that it is impossible to fully understand the organizational culture, and I would agree. I think it's possible to get a good idea of what life is like at this organization in time. But unwise leaders come in and poof, they're making changes and rearranging everything from floor to ceiling. Then they stand back amazed when their changes have little or no effect, or they encounter pushback from the natives who hold this culture dearly. You might be wondering why we would survey the climate of the organization and not assess the culture of the organization. I think the reason boils down to which has the most impact on the day-to-day effectiveness of the organization. Whereas culture defines who we are and how we do what we do, it is the climate that determines how we feel about who we are and what we do. The climate impacts the worker more directly than the culture. Certainly, if you want to make substantial changes to the organization, you must change the culture. But if you want quick changes, then you must focus on the climate. Now, bear in mind that when you focus on the climate, you're not going to be making long-term changes. You may be making daily changes, and you may eventually have an impact on the culture. But if you're trying to make those quick changes to turn things around and to see some positive gains, then probably the climate is an area you want to focus on. There are lots of surveys online that you can use to examine the culture of your organization. These surveys are to be given to members of the organization to gather their opinions about the components of the climate. Now, there are 4 components to the climate: the physical environment, which includes the buildings and facilities, technology and pedagogical inventions. The next is the social atmosphere, which includes the attitudes, morale, feelings, and values. Third is the structural components. This includes instruction, supervision, administration, communication, and control mechanisms. Lastly is people's perception of the culture and how they relate to it. Looking at these 4 areas can give you a good picture of the climate. Using this as a model, make sure that any surveys that you use address each of these areas. The point of examining the climate is that it informs you what the people are actually thinking and feeling. Now, that's assuming that they will answer the survey honestly, and that's not always the case. Now wait a minute, you say. Before this, you defined the culture as the organization's reality, and now you're saying to get a feel for what's going on, you need to look at the perceptions, which may or may not be accurate. That's correct. Often people's perceptions are more real to them than reality. This is what they choose to believe that is important, even if what they choose to believe is not consistent with the objective reality. So you could say that each one of us has an individual understanding or reality, which when combined with other people's conventional reality forms the climate of the organization. But at any rate, they still have a perception, and that perception is probably more real to them than reality. And so that's what you must deal with, is their perceptions. It's not an easy job to change one's perceptions, especially after they have been forming for a while. Just like you can't make a first impression a second time, you find it very difficult to change pre-existing perceptions because they become very ingrained in who we are, and it takes a long time to change someone's perceptions of that organization. So now we're at the place where I like to say, let's reflect a moment on what you read in this particular chapter, and have you think about, so what do we do with culture and this understanding? How does it help us as a budding leader? And that's where I've tried to end each of these little lecturettes or little teaching modules, is to think about, so how do we apply this? Well, first of all, I think that we have to recognize that the behavior within our organization is shaped by the culture of the organization. People are going to behave a certain way in our organization that's different from others. And so we have to accept that lots of the behavior is defined by who the employee is in relation to that culture. Now, this is not to say that their own motivations don't play a part of this, their personality. I mean, that's what we were talking about last week, is that some of their behavior is definitely inspired or it's instinctual based on who they are as individuals. But then add to that dynamic this cultural dynamic, and you'll see that, yep, this is going to have an impact on behavior. And so if you want to make your teachers more innovative, as many school leaders would like their teachers to be innovative in the classroom, it's not just a personality thing. It's not just a motivational thing. Well, we just need to motivate them. We need to inspire them. It's not just a professional development thing, as we've talked about the impact of professional development. There's a culture within the school that has communicated to these employees that not being innovative is okay. Just go in, do your little thing, and go home. Everybody has a happy day. So, understanding the culture that shapes that attitude is critical. And then you begin to see what is causing teachers to not be innovative. Yes, there is a certain amount of PD that they need. They're just not innovative because they haven't had the training. But then there's also part of the culture that has said that it's okay not to be innovative. We're this country little school, and it doesn't matter whether we're innovative or not, because they're going to work in the chicken processing plant anyway. Well, you know what? Why does that have to be the outcome for every student? Well, of course, you know it doesn't have to be. We have to change the culture, though, if we're going to get teachers to see that, you know what, they can be innovators in their classroom if they will take those steps to make that a reality. Next, I think it's important to recognize, and what I'm taking away from here is that culture can and should be changed. That it should not become this body of ideas that we never look at. And, well, once it's been established, this is who we are. And we can't change. We're not an innovative school, and we never will be. Well, with that kind of attitude, you're right, probably never will change because you've not recognized that you can change. And I think cultures can be changed. And I think the changes have to be very intense and deep-rooted changes. They can't just be superficial things, structural things, changing schedules, for example. They have to be really substantial changes in the way we see ourselves as a school, as an organization, as teachers, educators, leaders. So culture can be changed, and much of that work falls on the shoulders of the leader. Now, I realize that a lot of guys are so focused on the day by day, and by guys I'm referring to men and women, guys, that they don't think about, hey, I want to change things. So what they end up doing is all this piecemeal stuff. They try one thing to see if that makes a difference, and then they try something else, or they try a third thing. You see, that's not having a deep impact. That's all surface level stuff. They've got to start thinking about what is the culture of this organization. And that's going to really come when you start talking with the people about what's important. And I would take those elements of culture, the stories, the history, the relics, the symbols and traditions and rituals, and I would start asking people, what are the traditions of our school? What are the relics that we all point to? What are those stories that we constantly tell each other and laugh about and that kind of give us that warm fuzzy feeling? Because when you can change those, then you can change these very deep ideas of the organization. Not saying that those aren't important, but what I am saying is that if you want to turn the culture around because you want to make substantial changes and improvements, then you're going to have to deal with that and look at culture as this is what I've got to fix. And the teachers will probably rebel. Yep, some of them will at least, because you're touching on tradition, and there are those who feel like we have to conserve tradition. And I'm certainly a traditional guy. I like tradition. But if the organization is not being effective, then we've got to rethink the organization. And dealing with climate or dealing with the structural, dealing with the superficial is not going to have the impact that we want it to have. That's why changing curriculum oftentimes has minimal impact on the organization. Oh, you'll see a gain in test scores, but oftentimes, as we found with the Western Electric studies, just that little minor change of raising the light level in the work area produced greater productivity. And you may find that a new curriculum will increase test scores a little bit, but then after a while the test scores will slump right back down. It's because that kind of change, while maybe important, and we need to change the curriculum from time to time, that kind of change is not going to have lasting impact because, again, culture is what guides a lot of the behavior in your organization. And then thirdly, we've got to talk about climate, because you see, just dealing with the culture is one facet of climate, but not the only facet of the climate. And climate is that perception, that day in, day out feeling of what it's like to work at this place. And it can impact the behavior of the teachers, especially if the environment is very negative. And I've worked in places where the climate was very, very negative, and it's hard as all get out to get things done in a place where you've got a significant number of the staff who are constantly negative about what's going on, and they don't want to see any changes made at all, or they don't want to be a part of the solution. They just want to point out how bad things are. So from this perspective, then understanding climate's going to be key to what you do as a leader, but also you're going to have to work on the climate. And so it's a two-pronged approach for changing a school. So it's not just about changing culture, but while you're changing culture, which is what takes time, you must change the climate of the organization. And of course, climate change can happen through some of the physical things that you do in the school, changing personnel, changing schedules, changing curriculum, changing a host of surface level things can have an impact while you're doing the deeper cultural changes of, hey, I need you to be an innovator, but in order for me to do that, there are things I've got to change about what we believe, what we value, and the rules that we're going to live by. Well, this has been an interesting module to me, dealing with culture, and there's a lot more we could talk about it, but this will kind of give you some food for thought this week. Hope you have an awesome week, and we'll see you either online at our next WebEx class meeting or in the discussion threads. Have a great rest of your week.